Good morning, everyone. My name is Neera Tandon. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the Center for American Progress. I'm really excited about today's event, which is a book discussion with David Rolf. 3.5 years ago, more than 200 New York City fast food workers walked off their jobs to demand a $15 wage and a union. They may not have known it at the time, but their courage would spark a national movement. And months later, workers won a $15 minimum wage in SeaTac, Washington, and then in Seattle thereafter. The fight for 15 has united low-wage workers across the country in a call for better wages and a voice on the job, pushing policymakers across the country to raise state and local minimum wage laws. And it's working. In the last month alone, legislators in New York and California announced new laws to put their states on a path to a $15 minimum wage. These cities and states understand that our economy is stronger when employees are empowered to organize for fair wages, decent benefits, and a better workplace. That's something that the Center for American Progress has been focused on for years. We need to keep pushing for wages that meet the needs of modern families and jobs that offer the basic pillars of a middle-class economic security. And today, we're lucky to be joined by one of the leaders in this movement, David Rolf. From 1995 to 1999, David led the organization of 75,000 home care aides in Los Angeles, the largest union organizing campaign since the 1940s. Since founding Seiu 775 in 2002, he has led its growth from 1,600 to 44,000 members through new organizing, helping create double the pay of its members, and bargaining contracts that have created health care, paid time off, and other benefits for a workforce that has long been excluded from the labor movement. And in the past 3 years, David led the campaign for $15 minimum wage in SeaTac and Seattle, where we were really proud to work with him. So there's a reason he's been called the most successful union organizer of the last 15 years. Today he'll discuss his new book on why the debate around decent minimum wages has taken on new urgency and how the fight for 15 is empowering workers to demand a seat at the table, not just in these cities, but really around the country. In the fight for 15, the right wage for working America, David digs into the roots of American inequality and what we can all do to rebuild the middle class. Joining him on stage is Lydia DePillis, a former Washington Post reporter who will soon be heading south to cover economics at the Houston Chronicle. Over the last 3 years, Lydia has reinvigorated the Post labor beat, covering everything from the fight for 15 protests to the emerging gig economy. As a fantastic reporter who knows how to let workers' stories speak for themselves, she will certainly be missed inside the Beltway. We're thrilled to have them both, and I welcome them to the stage.
Thank you, Neera, for that lovely introduction. I'm so glad to be here with my fellow Seattleite, David Rolf, on a very Seattle-ish morning in Washington, the lesser Washington. So this book was a really good read. Congratulations, not all policy wonky manifestos actually are fun to get through. But I want to ask you a little bit about where the book came from. It's not actually entirely about, spoiler alert, like the $15 wage fight. It's actually about the labor movement and how to fix conditions for working class people. Have you been wanting to write this for a long time, and this just was a news peg?
You know, it's funny, no. I never thought I'd be an author of anything longer than maybe a short essay in a magazine. But I did, first of all, thanks to Neera and Cap for hosting us this morning. I should say that first of all. But as she mentioned, I had a chance in the 1990s to lead a really large union organizing drive that was kind of, at the time, New York Times front page above the fold news. And I didn't write about it, and I got to then spend 15 years reading other people getting the story wrong. So when a publisher called and asked if I wanted to write about the fight for 15 in Seattle, I said I would. So that's really where the book came from.
Yeah, it's useful to have a comprehensive history of that, both as this case study and just as a fun story about how this all came about.
Thank you.
So as you're starting to see that process repeat itself in other states with sort of leverage exerted and politicians coming along for the ride. You come to a pretty bold conclusion, though, at a certain point, which is that the model we have for organizing now, like on a business-by-business basis, is sort of vastly inadequate, pointless, and it's pointless to try to reinvigorate that or restore that. And I'm wondering how and when you came to that conclusion.
I think over a period of years. You know, the American system of enterprise bargaining is currently inaccessible to 94% of American workers. And that would be fine if there was a single example of a rich democracy sustaining both a democracy and a growing middle class.
Explain that just because I know that 10 or 11% of American workers are represented.
Private sector workers, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so if you want to have a middle class and you want to have a democracy, you have to have a labor movement. Like there's simply no counterexamples in the first world. So the question is, what kind do you want? And do you want one that's built like ours? We have an enterprise-based system that it really depends on workers organizing workplace by workplace, employer by employer. Not only are our laws hopelessly out of date and make organizing really inaccessible to most private sector workers, but let's just say workers do, here's what happens, right? Workers try to organize. Employers have a huge incentive to try to stop them. So the union avoidance industry is huge. Employers want to avoid unions if they can, bust them where they exist, and minimize their bargaining demands based on the perception that if unions grow and exist, it'll make them less flexible or less successful. There are alternative models in the world, right, where instead of bargaining employer by employer, you could bargain for a sector or a region all at once. In Denmark, I think someone's here from the embassy, the Employer Association of Food Service Employers bargains with the Union of Food Service Workers, and McDonald's employees make $21 an hour. So, I think that we shouldn't give up on a labor movement, but these, we should not unquestioningly embrace the model that Congress assigned to a different labor movement in a different economy in 1935. I think it's time. The point I make at the end is, now's a moment for risk-taking and innovation and building new models instead of trying to resurrect old ones.
Right, and you invested though early, in labor, right? Was there a moment of epiphany when you thought this is all not going to help this traditional thing that we're doing?
I was sitting in an SEIU executive board meeting in New Orleans in 2012 when the president of that local that used to have 6,000 members and now has 1,200 members was talking about the chambers of commerce in Louisiana going to court to get anti-labor injunctions, preventing local school boards from bargaining with school bus driver unions. And I was like, where are we? Did we somehow go back to 1928 before the passage of the Norris-LaGuardia Act? Like, in what world do you get anti-labor injunctions again? So I thought, maybe it's time to investigate the proposition that workers still need power now more than ever. Workers still need higher wages. Democracies still need strong labor movements. But maybe the particular model that was optimized for the industrial economy of 1935, when both labor and capital were far less mobile than now, and at a time when the federal government was broadly committed to using collective bargaining in eras of world wars, cold wars, and depressions, maybe it's time for a refresh.
So I think a lot of labor leaders buy that and they understand it, but at the same time, like the newspaper industry, like your bread and butter comes from your traditional membership, and so it's hard to see a way to a path to new forms of organization that'll be as powerful as what you have or have had in the not too distant past. So what does a big union like the Teamsters or the auto workers do? Do they keep trying to organize workers in the traditional model, or just give up on that and transform into something else?
Well, listen, people should do what they need to do, but John L. Lewis in the 1930s had it right. He invested the top talent and all the resources of the United Mine Workers, which was already then a union in decline, into building the next labor movement. It wasn't fundamentally different than what Andy Grove did at Intel in 1982 when cheap Japanese memory was flooding the American market, or what Jobs did when he came back to Apple, or Gerstner at IBM. He recognized the strategic inflection point facing the movement at that moment and made a big bet on an alternative model. that then powered the creation of an American middle class for the next 80 years.
Are you that guy?
No, I mean, listen, I don't know. I think the challenge for today's labor leaders is inventing the next model. And I don't think there's not an off-the-shelf one that we can just say we've proven works. This is why, I talk a lot about risk-taking and experimentation. What we really need is sort of a Y Combinator for the next labor movement.
Which you have, sort of, in the form of the Workers Lab.
Yeah, it's one small effort, yeah.
Cool little startup incubator, helping some worker-friendly tech things back in Seattle. So getting to the point of the book, which is this new wage is a super powerful way of boosting people out of poverty. Like, indisputably, if you give people more money per hour, they will be less poor. But not all.
So complicated. So
I mean,
controversial.
there's some arguments around the edges that people will make, which we can get to later. But not all liberal politicians are on board with that. I mean, they've moved a long way over the past couple years. Mm-hmm. But even Hillary Clinton, whom the SEIU has endorsed, has said that in places that would be potentially even harmful. Even Tom Perez, who's sort of Labor's favorite labor secretary in recent years, is concerned about what would happen if a $15 wage were uniform. How do you explain that fissure even among progressives, and what's the deal?
Well, I think some of this is a lot of smoke and very little fire. Hillary Clinton's been for every actual $15 campaign that's actually occurred in every city and every state. I accept that my economist friends, even on the left, are economists. And so they're going to say, unless we can prove something's already been true, we're not going to predict it's going to be true in the future. But what we can say now is this, right? Like, the two cities with the highest per capita number of restaurants are the two cities with the highest minimum wage, Seattle and San Francisco. We can say that every time the federal minimum wage has gone up since 1937, the arguments against it have been consistently the same from the right wing. It's going to hurt the people it's intended to help. It's going to cause joblessness, and businesses are going to close or leave. And that simply never happened anywhere. 82% of the time, federal minimum wage increases have correlated with increases in overall employment. 18% of the time, they've correlated with no change in employment, and 0% of the time have they correlated with an increase in unemployment. I accept that the academic study of economics is reluctant to predict future things that can't be proven from the past. And it's undoubtedly true that if you eat too many green vegetables, they'll kill you. But it's a far greater risk to eat no green vegetables. And I think the same is true about minimum wages. It's undoubtedly true that there's some hypothetical point you could raise them to that would be harmful. We just haven't found that point yet in the US. And the McDonald's workers in Denmark are an example of this, right? If McDonald's is not a stupid company, if they couldn't make money in that market, they wouldn't be there. But somehow you can buy a burger for around the same price as you can buy a burger in the US. For the same reason, I expect that Starbucks costs about the same for an Americano in Tokyo that it does in Seattle, despite the fact that rents are 5 times as high. And I think what this really shows is that businesses are innovative and entrepreneurial, and if there's a change in one price point in their overall supply chain, they're actually going to figure it out.
Right. But there probably is some point, right, at which people will accelerate the automation that they have, and so that they need for your workers, et cetera, et cetera. Like, is it okay if a higher minimum wage causes some job loss? And
well, first of all, it actually hasn't happened.
Okay.
But listen, I think that we do need to prepare for a future where there are two schools of thought on automation. One is that it's a Luddite fallacy that's always been predicted and never come true. The other is that this time is different because of Moore's law and the rapid pace of technological change. And the data will ultimately prove which one is right. I happen to think universal basic income and a high minimum wage work well in combination to produce tighter labor markets, more consumer spending power, and lure. And if McDonald's wants to lure you out of your rock band or off your couch to go and cook French fries, they ought to have to pay a premium for that. So yeah, I think that if we did find that small increases in unemployment that related to giant increases in consumer spending power did happen. That might be a trade-off worth making, but that's not actually what's happened anywhere in our actual experience. We have a 70% consumer demand-driven economy. And my friend Nick Hanauer, who I quote in the book, The Fight for 15, makes the point that even billionaires and non-billionaires need approximately the same number of blue jeans. And so even though their blue jeans might cost 5 times as much, they're not going to keep enough people employed sewing, manufacturing, and transporting blue jeans to stimulate the blue jeans economy. It's going to take lots of people who work at McDonald's, who work at any company, who are able to go to the store and buy things in order to keep a consumer demand-driven economy successful. This is what, until a year and a half ago, Brazil had figured out to produce 20 years of economic growth and lift 20 million people out of poverty, and what China's figuring out. America's in this strange position of we used to have the world's biggest middle class, then we did trickle-down economics, and now we have the world's 27th biggest middle class.
I want to ask about some places outside of Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, that are on a path to $15 now. The far bigger problem in many states is that conservative state legislatures have stepped in and said, no, thou shalt not, small city, raise your minimum wage. And that's an immediate political problem, but it's a real one for
sure.
Forestall, if we accept the reality that nothing's happening in Congress, at least this year. So is there any kind of strategy that folks can look towards?
Well, I saw yesterday that the workers in Montgomery, Alabama are suing their governor over the preemption legislation there. I think that we ought to operate in the lanes we can operate in. In cities we can raise it, we should raise it. In states we can raise it, we should raise it. And when the governor of Alabama finds that no one wants to work there anymore, then that'll be a delight for all the states where those workers flood to in order to get $15 jobs.
Yeah, although I've heard of an interesting wrinkle that could cause if some states do it and some states don't, right? Lots of workers flood to the state, then lowering the wages there.
Well, no, it's interesting. We looked at, when I chaired the mayor's minimum wage task, I was co-chaired with a business counterpart, the mayor's minimum wage task force in Seattle, and we looked at every example of cross-border, and we had a ton of data available to us. We had essentially 2 whole academic departments on contract to research these questions because these all came up, youth unemployment, cross-border situations, and it turns out that in almost all cases when one jurisdiction raises their wage and another leaves it the same, businesses don't generally, the experiences and the data shows that businesses don't flee the higher wage territory, workers actually come into the higher wage territory. So when you look at San Francisco, when they raised their minimum wage significantly above the California minimum about 15 years ago, a few things happened. Number one, all of the sky is falling predictions did not come true. Number two, during the following recession, San Francisco lost jobs more slowly than the surrounding jurisdiction, and during the recovery, they gained them faster. And restaurant and bar employment overall increased slightly. So, in the chapter, I think 6, 7 of the book, The Fight for 15, I make the point the sky has never fallen. And, all of the data-resistant, anecdote-based, fear-based conservative prophecies about what happens when you raise minimum wages have just never happened. In 1913, the head of the Department Store Federation told Congress that if they prevented children from working more than 8 hours a day, all department stores would close. Now, Amazon.com may help that happen in the current era, but 103 years later, all department stores have still not closed, despite the fact that children aren't permitted to work 12 hours a day. And the head of the American Publishers Association in 1937 said that America would fall like ancient Rome if we established a federal minimum wage. Now, my recollection of my Roman history is that the overexpansion of empire and the arrogance of power may have had something to do with Rome falling, but not the fact that they established a minimum wage.
Although that would have been a thing.
Yeah, it would have been a thing, right?
Right. Well, yeah, perhaps industry doesn't do itself any favors by making doomsday predictions that don't.
Yeah. In 1988, Washington state voters eliminated the tip credit, which means that wages for restaurant workers doubled in a single day. And over time, with other state minimum wage increases, we now pay 400% of what restaurant workers in Texas get. Tom Perez said to me at one point, I keep packing my lunch every time I come to Seattle because I expect to see no restaurants there. Guess what? We have lots of one. It's a great foodie city. But the Washington Restaurant Association every year publishes a survey of their members predicting how many thousands of jobs will be lost. They've been doing this now for over 20 years. And every year they've been wrong. And every single year since they've been publishing that survey, restaurant employment has gone up.
So going back to the Washington situation and the Seattle situation, you talk about the role of the media in propelling that momentum. And I think that it's hard to extract popular media from the polling around the minimum wage across the country and the rapidity with which this is taken off. I think about this a lot as a journalist because I know that the success of these protests and depends on whether or not someone shows up. I mean, there's like lots of cities and media. Social media is a big thing. Yeah. Would all of this be happening if reporters hadn't taken as much interest as they have? And what happens when they decide to say, like, uh-oh, maybe this isn't that new?
Well, boy, you're the journalist and I'm the labor leader, so maybe you should tell me. But, I think fast food strikes were news, right? We had an industry that there was never a union, there was never strikes, there were never a mass worker mobilization, and that started happening in an era of really weak unions, really weak labor laws, and after 40 years of relentlessly being told that the only way for the economy to grow is to give more money and less regulation to billionaires and to make workers poor. So I think the reason journalists covered it was because it was actual news.
Yeah, I agree that it was news, but sometimes like a protest happens and the similar one happened the previous week and the previous week, and it's like you can only tell so many stories of people who have the same basic story.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta think the real heroes of this story are the workers who had the courage to walk off the job without the protection of a union in a non-union industry against some of the world's most famous global brands. And that's really the story of the fight for 15, isn't, listen, media played a role, labor leaders played a role, faith community, social justice community, anti-poverty organizers, progressive mayors and socialist city council members in Seattle, governors like Andrew Cuomo who evolved very quickly from thinking this was unrealistic to thinking that's the new civil rights movement. And so there's lots of credit, and lots of credit should be taken because it really, not to coin a phrase, does take a village to raise the wage. But I think the people who deserve the most credit are people like Carolyn DeRocher, who walked off her Taco Bell job one night on May 29th in Seattle and sparked the first strikes that certainly the media covered, but that captivated the attention of the public and really compressed public opinion around a demand for $15 in Seattle.
Right. So all of these wage hikes right now, the major ones, are happening with the assistance of politicians who found it in their interest to do it. And is that going to be enough for, say, fast food workers, right? Like next time the $15 minimum wage becomes too little, right? The tagline right now is $15 and a union.
Right.
And sometimes it seems like SEIU strategy is like wave a magic wand and a union will appear. And like I know that there's a path, but it's like very tenuous. Like, can you spell that out? How that actual form of worker power outside of the help of politicians is going to manifest?
Well, American workers have always depended on good public policy in order to facilitate the growth of worker organizations. That was true in New York in the 1910s after the Triangle Fire. It was true in the 30s with the passage of the Wagner Act. It remains true today that, unfortunately, workers need the help of elected officials and public policy in order to exercise power and build sustainable, powerful, sustainable, and scalable organizations to represent their interest. I I don't think we're going anywhere. I don't think that McDonald's or any of the big global fast food chains should rest easy at night thinking that just because a handful of blue cities passed a $15 policy that somehow their responsibility to their workforce and to the economy has lessened. I think workers want 15 in a union, and the workers I've met in the fight for 15 and who've walked off the job are going to be, I would say, they're going to persevere and they're going to be impatient until both demands get met, not just one.
And does to them, in your estimation, a union mean the thing that it's meant for the last few decades, or is it sort of more conceptual?
No. I mean, at the end of the day, if we think about outcomes, that's what's really important. What the mid-20th century collective bargaining model produced was worker organizations that were powerful enough to raise wages and benefits faster than inflation, scalable to touch tens of millions of people, and sustainable in as much as they had a revenue stream independent of government or philanthropy. And those are really the core outcomes that a workers' movement has to solve for. Two American generals were dictators of two countries after World War II. General MacArthur imposed American-style collective bargaining on Japan, and General Eisenhower resurrected an older industrial and sectoral bargaining model for Germany. Today, Japan's been in the fourth decade of a recession, and Germany has the largest middle class in the world. Their automobile workers make twice as much as ours do, and they make twice as many automobiles. So we have design choices about what kind of collective bargaining regime we want and what kind of labor movement we want. And I think it would be foolish for these worker leaders to, just take off the shelf a system that was designed by smart lawyers from New York in 1935, but which is increasingly inaccessible to the majority of American workers today. At the core of this, it's about how workers exercise power at scale in a sustainable way. It's not about the Wagner Act.
Right. I mean, I think there's lots of people in this room who could design a dream labor relations system, and would love to see it passed. In the interim, though, so we mentioned the new, some of those new worker organizations that have tremendous potential. You go through them, and then you say, well, they all have challenges, and
They all do.
Right, probably inadequate. And you talk about some of the successful campaigns of the past, like Justice for Janitors, and your own campaigns in the home care industry, all of which required a huge investment in resources. Fight for 15 itself, right? Only a few strong unions can take that on, and there's often internal resistance to spending that much money on new, maybe members, maybe not members. So do you think, do philanthropists need to step up and chip in to help this happen in the shorter term?
So I think the role of philanthropy is interesting when we talk about the alt-labor organizations, because on the one hand, without progressive philanthropy, most of those organizations couldn't exist. On the other hand, we certainly don't, I think ultimately, any form of worker organization has to solve for power, scale, and sustainability, independent of philanthropy, if it wants to be a legitimate and independent voice for workers. So I think that there is a sort of a seed stage venture funding role that both unions and philanthropies can play in the next labor movement, but ultimately it's going to have to be owned by workers, and we'll have to figure out some revenue generating mechanism to make those organizations really sustainable.
Okay. I love hearing Sarah Horowitz talk about worker organizations.
Yeah.
The Freelancers Union provides healthcare and other things. Pivoting to the sort of technological side of this stuff, I'm sure you get questions about Uber a lot. And last week there was a $100 million settlement in the big cases against Uber for misclassifying its workers as contractors rather than employees. And you signed this statement along with a bunch of sharing economy leaders saying, lawsuits are really beside the point. We should really develop a system for allowing people to have benefits that can travel from gig to gig as necessary. The AFL-CIO has been a little bit more circumspect and said, these guys are actually employees and should receive employee benefits.
So I signed a statement calling for universal, portable, and prorated benefits in the on-demand economy, which is an idea that Nick Hanauer and I, thought about and published in a Democracy Journal article last summer. And many people, many CEOs and venture capitalists, along with academics and alt-labor leaders in the on-demand economy, sort of agreed with those principles and put out a 2-page statement in November about that. You know, lawsuits will win or lose based on the facts in each case, right? There are, without naming the names of companies, I could describe easily a number of on-demand economy companies that clearly are engaged in wide-scale misclassification of employees. And there are others that clearly are marketplaces for independent contractors. And there are others where judges and regulators may have to make tough calls in gray areas based on each set of state laws or federal laws. So I think the on-demand economy is not monolithic, just like the labor movement's not. And there are examples of high-road companies and low-road companies, of people obeying the law, of people violating the law. The idea of having worker-owned, portable, prorated, and universal benefits isn't just for the on-demand economy. You think about people working at two weekend shifts at 7-Eleven without health benefits. You think about the incredibly common practice now of retail and fast food employers capping hours through algorithmic-based scheduling software at 29.75 to avoid the employer mandate under the ACA. The on-demand economy did not create the fishering of the workplace. It only took 4 years between the Treaty of Detroit, which was when America really first began assigning pension and health plan contributions to employers, and the moment when a brilliant blender salesman named Ray Kroc imported a model from the sewing machine industry called franchising, bought out the marketing rights to his largest customer, the McDonald's brothers hamburger stand, and created a business model that centralized profit, decentralized risk, and consigned workers to permanent poverty. So although I'm a customer in the on-demand economy, I'm an advocate of on-demand economy workers, there are good and bad companies operating in that space, but it's a small part of the overall economy. And what David Weil, the wage and hour director at DOL, calls fishering of American work didn't start with Uber, it started with McDonald's. And they went on to Kelly Girl, which in the 1960s advertised to employers that they would provide employees who never chipped a tooth, never slipped a disc, never got a migraine, quote unquote, at least not on your dime. And then we saw domestic outsourcing in the 70s, global outsourcing in the 80s. So I think this long-term trend of evading employer responsibilities in some ways related to America's unique experiment in privatizing the social contract all onto employers rather than through a broader system of providing benefits. If anything, we might need a shorter employment contract, a longer social contract, in order to make things balance in the 21st century.
Employers might need to sort of get on board with that idea.
Yeah, I mean, if every employer was responsible for a $15 wage, fair scheduling, workplace non-discrimination, safe workplaces, and paying 35% of payroll costs into a worker-owned benefit fund, wouldn't that be in some ways better than this exhaustive list of things that are voluntaristic in their nature that General Motors and IBM and General Electric do, while McDonald's and Uber and others do nothing? Like, that sort of facilitates and encourages a race to the bottom instead of having one floor that everyone has to adhere to.
Should we take some questions from audience? I don't know if I'm in charge of calling on people. Okay, that hand that went up just now.
Sam Jennings. I used to be, well, for years I was a wage and hour investigator for the U.S. Department of Labor. My comment/question is, you hear a lot about living wage in Washington, D.C. Right around the corner from where I live sits, on 22nd and M Streets, sits a big Hilton Hotel.
Yeah.
That property sat derelict for years until D.C. government came and gave them tax breaks and all kinds of incentive, basically using my money, subsidizing the construction of that hotel that now pays its restaurant workers $2.77 an hour. What's with that?
In the book, I quote a conservative economic researcher who was asked why Volkswagen treats its employees so much better in Germany than they do in the South, and that conservative economists said because they can get away with it here. And I think that this hotel, whoever owns and operates the Hilton branded hotel at 22nd and M, are doing what they can get away with. Yep.
Over here on the right.
Hi, my name is Dina Kastner. I work for the National Association of Social Workers, and I'm also a member of the Washington-Baltimore News Guild. And just wanted to ask, you talk a lot about big companies. What about small businesses, and what are the arguments there?
Well, I was on a panel at the White House a couple years ago, right after we passed our $15 minimum wage, with a record store owner from Kansas City who said, all I need is time. He said, if you tell me I have to raise my wage in 7 weeks, I might go out of business, but if you give me time to plan, I can restructure my debt, I can think about the other costs in my supply chain, I can plan for it. So what we did in Seattle was we adopted a phased-in $15 minimum wage that went very fast for large companies that didn't provide health benefits, and went slowest for small businesses that did provide health benefits. So it's either a 3-year, a 4-year, a 5-year, or a 7-year phase-in, based on the facts that accord to each company. But at the end, everyone gets to 15, and then it adjusts for inflation. So my father-in-law did not work for Starbucks. He ran a very small chain of coffee stores in Seattle. He bought them when there were 2 stores. He grew them to 7 stores. Then he sold them and retired. And when a member of Seattle City Council initially proposed a paid sick leave law in 2012, his first reaction was to be viscerally against it. It's going to put me out of business. And then he got out his calculator, and he figured out one of 2 things was going to happen. Either he would raise his prices, pass along the minuscule difference to the consumer, or he wouldn't, counting that on his customers to raise theirs, then he'd increase his volume even though his margins went down. But smart business people figure out how to adapt to all kinds of things. Insurance rates go up, rent goes up, taxes go up or down. The price of coffee beans, and a hurricane strikes Central America and coffee beans triple in price. Nevertheless, we can all still buy a cup of coffee. So I think that it's undoubtedly true that small businesses churn fast, right? A lot come into the market, a lot go out of business because not every business is going to succeed. But wages are only one factor in that. And, my view is that if you give people time to plan, that smart businesses will adapt and succeed. And, there's not a constitutional right to operate a small business. If a woman who runs a farm in the Central Valley of California told me 2 weeks ago, we've always paid $15 to our workers, and if we couldn't do that and still make money, we shouldn't be in business.
Certainly helps to be able to sell coffee in Seattle, just an addictive substance in an addictive place. Other questions? More hands. Okay, here in front.
My name's Marty Coburn. To follow up on what you've just said, how have businesses actually managed the increased wage? I mean, somebody in the system has to take less. Either it's vendors have to take less, or management has to take less, or owners have to take less, or consumers have to pay more. So is there any data, any sense of how the wage, the increased wage is being paid for?
In Seattle overall, we have seen no there's a couple data points here. In the overall economy of Seattle, we have not seen faster inflation than in the country as a whole. In white tablecloth restaurants, we have. So there's been some reasonably small, some single-digit price increases in food prices at restaurants, not in grocery stores, for example. But, the global brands that operate, McDonald's is the largest provider of food in the world. Walmart's the largest private sector employer in the world. And, and many of these companies spend 91% of their revenue manipulating their own stock price through share buybacks and dividends. Instead of investing in their workforce, instead of doing R&D, instead of bringing new products to market. And this is this part of this sort of corrupt system of self-enrichment that the SEC blessed in the early 80s through a rule change. Congress never voted on it, that incentivizes CEOs who put their friends on their board, and then everyone owns shares, and then the more shares they buy back, the higher stock price goes up, and then they get bigger bonuses. And that's where 91% of the Fortune 500's profits are going right now, not into either enhancing the long-term strength of those companies or investing in their own workforces.
Back there in the middle.
Good morning. I'm James Trout. I'm a person with Asperger's syndrome, and I work with the Respectability USA, or a disability rights organization based in Rockville. My question for you is essentially this: in the disability community, we've had similar wage issues, for example, and in some cases, people have been fighting to eliminate sub-minimum wages.
Yeah.
New Hampshire just eliminated theirs, and Maryland, as did Maryland. Where do you this is a big deal with us because the unemployment rate for people with disabilities is the same now as it was when the ADA was passed a quarter century ago. What impact would you say that raising the minimum wage to 15% would have with the employment rate for PWDs? Thank you.
Yeah, so I will confess this is one, I don't recall reading a study on this during our 4 months of the Seattle Income and Equality Advisory Committee. We read studies on youth unemployment, on minority community unemployment. I actually don't remember a study on PWD unemployment. I'll say this. First of all, I think that people with disabilities should make living wages just like everyone else should make living wages. Number two, our laws shouldn't, through sheltered workshops or other sort of special deals that employers get, allow people to be employed at sub-minimum wages. And, I'd be interested, I won't claim a special subject matter expertise on this particular corner of my topic, but if you have ideas, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, that's a tricky and huge issue. And I think the understanding is generally and I'm sure you know this, sir, but when you raise minimum wages for people with disabilities, you just need to increase the supports that they have to operate in those kinds of environments as well. All right, more questions. You, sir.
Hi, my name is Garrett, and I work for AR LLC, and I have a question about labor in your home state. In light of the recent Supreme Court decision, why is SEIU 775 still collecting dues from thousands of state-paid home care aides that have refused to sign union membership cards?
That's a legal question that relates to current litigation, so I'm not going to answer it.
Back there in the corner.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Abby Keeble. I work at ICM Sagallon with Rafe, who wishes
Hi. Thank you, guys. Great work.
you. At ICM Sagallon, we're Mr. Rolf's literary agency. So I studied economics at Georgetown, and so it was even more of a shock to do the classic going into the real world and realizing all the lies you've been told. So, the biggest or most, I think, overtold argument against the minimum wage is, minimum wage functions as a price floor, and like you said, the sky is going to fall as a result. And as you've talked about, clearly that is just not how it works in actuality, because in these economic models, there are all these assumptions that just don't apply to the real world. So I guess my question is, knowing that and seeing that, what approach can we take, or not we ourselves, but the Fed, whoever is controlling it, how do you view economic models? Are they still useful in some senses, or real data?
Yeah. So again, labor leader, not economist, although I do a ton of economic research and write about this stuff a fair amount. Here's one observation. If your theory of astronomy was that the sun was going to rise in Washington, D.C. every day at noon, and you went through a whole lifetime, and not on a single day did the sun ever rise at noon. So the scientific method dictates that you would have to reject your theory and adopt a new theory, right? Since time immemorial, the right wing has been predicting that if wages go up, employment will go down, businesses will close or leave, and it simply doesn't happen. So the scientific method should suggest that neoclassical economic models, at least with respect to minimum wage increases, should be wholesale rejected, and we need new models. Because I'd get these letters when we were serving on the mayor's minimum wage task force from these economists that I've been a PhD, I've been doing this for 35 years, I advise all these big companies, and you have to understand neoclassical economics teaches that if wages go up, employment will go down. And I'd write back, well, yeah, I understand that's what your model teaches, it just never is true. It's sort of like someone made this point on an article last week, I forget the author, but I'm oversimplifying, but sort of neoclassical economics and trickle-down economics is to real economics what astrology is to astronomy. A sort of primitive, superstitious way of intimidating people into obeying the philosopher priests rather than actually understanding data in the real world. So no, I think there is valuable economic data, there's valuable economic modeling. I just think that we should now understand trickle-down economics for what it is, which is an intimidation tactic masquerading as an economic theory. It's like the Flat Earth Society or something, those people, I'll go further. Trickle-down economists and the people who practice and preach trickle-down economists should be publicly shamed and ridiculed. They're actually traitors. They've hurt the economy. If anyone, I say this in my book and I'll say it now. If Jerry Ford or Jimmy Carter had given a speech and said, my fellow Americans, we're going to create more wealth in the next 30 years than has been created in all of human history. We're going to give 95% of it to the top 1%. We're going to give 5% of it to the top 10%. We're going to give none of it to the bottom 90%. We're going to make the bottom 50% take a pay cut. We're going to eliminate pensions, eliminate unions, import third world wages, export manufacturing. We're going to shred the funding system for urban and rural public schools. We're going to make debt-free college a thing of the past, transfer healthcare costs onto consumers, and we're going to replace old Jim Crow laws with new apartheid, economic apartheid for black and brown Americans. And we're going to make sure that the net economic impact of women doubling their workforce participation is $0 in take-home pay for the bottom 90% of income earners, even while the stock market triples in its value. No one would have voted for that vision. But that's the reality we got through the malice and negligence of leaders of both political parties who, follow the wrong leaders, listen to the wrong advice. And if an honest conservative in 1975 really believed that deregulation, privatization, detaxation, and deunionization was a path to broadly shared prosperity, we now have a 40-year experiment that proves that person wrong. So it's time for a new plan.
I hope Art Laffer is out there somewhere in the audience. Ma'am. Yeah.
I'm Fran Hoffman, a retired sociologist, and actually a question that has been bubbling in my mind is why at this historical moment are we in fact seeing some very interesting new movements? And a second slightly related question is the movement within restaurant work to de-tip many of.
Yeah.
So those are interesting experiments. I'm interested in your point of view on it, but more significantly is how do we explain why in this very weird political season we're seeing some very progressive and interesting labor phenomenon?
Yeah, the old model failed, and it's time for a new one. And I think, I give Mary Kay Henry, our international president, a lot of credit for making the investment in the fight for 15. And if in chapter 3 of the book, I talk a lot about sort of the hidden history of worker resistance over the last 20 or 30 years. That even while the Wall Street Journal and Fox News were preaching the Washington consensus of austerity, there were things ranging from union campaigns like Justice for Janitors and Home Care to alt-labor campaigns from you mentioned the Restaurant Opportunity Center's campaign about tips, National Domestic Workers, Day Laborers Associations, Occupy, our Walmart campaign, where workers have kind of grown tired of waiting for Congress and CEOs to do the right thing on their own. And through a variety of the local living wage movement that started in the 90s, the Working Families Party in New York, there's actually a huge and proliferating number of interesting experiments that attempt to lift workers up in a 21st century economy. The Fight for 15 happens to be the biggest home run so far, but as people used to say, the objective conditions really call for action. And we didn't have to, becoming a low-wage nation is a choice, and we should make a different one. And I think that after 40 years of tolerating the austerity and trickle-down model, workers have had enough, and they're finally standing up and doing something about it. With respect to the tip issue, tipping is it's complicated, it's old, it's cultural, it's very specifically American, and has a strong gender and racial element to it. So undoubtedly would be best. Like, I don't have to tip my lawyer, if I don't like the job he or she does, I just hire a different one. But somehow I have to tip my server. I'm happy to do it under the current system, but it would be undoubtedly better if we just treated a wage as a wage.
That is unfortunately all we have time for. Thank you all for the questions and for being here. Thank you to David.
Thank you, Lydia. And thank you, Neera and Cap.
All right.